All right, guys, how's it going? Hope you guys have had a nice break so far. Um, this video is going to be about starting our cognition unit, which is one of the largest units of the course. Historically, I break that down into a few different components. Um, from the College Board's perspective, this includes things like memory and intelligence, which we are definitely not covering memory. And depending on how long these videos go, we may or may not cover intelligence as well. Usually, I do that kind of as a separate thing, just to kind of space things out because this unit is kind of really large and really dense. Um, so usually I just kind of narrow it down to just talking about thought and how that works, and language and how that works. Two very small things, right, in the field of psychology. Kind of without further ado, let's kind of jump right in, and hopefully, when we come back to school, we'll have a few days just to kind of review this, go over what questions you have, and then try to make sense of everything. If you're wondering what's the new setting, I'm in my living room. That is a map of Philly behind me. Just so if you guys are curious as to where I'm broadcasting from, but right in the middle of the living room on the couch. All right, so let's dive right into the objectives for this first section here. Let's try that again. There we go. And that is, we're going to talk about mental representations and basically try to figure out what's the difference between all of the different types of how we think and what it is that we're actually thinking about. And then we're going to get into problem solving strategies, specifically algorithms and heuristics, and try to figure out how they work differently from something like insight, which is a pretty interesting and fun thing to study. So that's our work for this first part about thought. So let's kind of dive right in. So if you remember, guys, cognition basically just means thought. And when we've talked before in the history of psychology, that we are, that cognitive psych is the study of our kind of internal world, right? Our mental life. So when we talk about cognition and we talk about thought, what we're really talking about is something that we call mental representations. So whenever we think about something, that's what we're talking about with a mental representation, because we can't think about nothing, right? We can't be thinking without that being attached to something that we are thinking about. It's impossible to think about nothing. We can think about nothingness, but we can't have the object of our thought be nothing. So we use the term mental representation to differentiate between, say, the computer that's in front of me and when I'm thinking about my computer. Um, I'm using mental representations when I'm thinking about my computer and versus the computer that's actually in front of me. Um, it's kind of a pretty standard definition, but it's an important one because it shows that there is a difference between the object in our minds and the objects in the real world, that they behave differently. Okay, so let's talk about another area here called mental concepts. So usually people store information in these kind of abstract, generalized concepts, right? Which is where we get the idea of a mental concept. They help organize specific individual experiences of the objects and events into categories, and then represent those properties of the category rather than each individual instance. So basically, it's taking the things that they all have in common. So, for instance, here we've got all these different types of dogs, right? So, even though they look very differently, from the Doberman to the Husky to the Airedale, I think. Um, while there are many different types of breeds, they are very clearly all dogs. So we have a mental concept of dog in our heads that we then can apply to the individual instances. So this isn't necessarily the most efficient thing. Well, actually, I lied. This is the more efficient thing than if we were thinking of things as like the individual objects, or if we had what some people might call a photographic memory, which doesn't exist. But they just have really good memories. I'm getting on tangents even in the video. That's sad. So, but mental concepts, right? There are. It's a more efficient way of us to organize our mental world, right? That we see things as dogs, as concepts, rather than individual models of or individuals in within a larger group. Hopefully, that made some sense. Um, so there are many different ways of how we create these mental concepts, right? From we can go as far back to the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. Plato said that we are born with all the mental concepts we need, and that as we go through life, we are just basically remembering the concepts that we had. So when we see dogs, we're remembering the fact that there is this thing called a dog. Aristotle, on the other hand, said you'd build everything up from experience. So we're going to see kind of similar arguments made by modern day psychologists as we go through these different ways that we develop mental concepts. So first up, we have concepts as sets of common features. So if we're thinking of flowers, right, one model says that we define concepts in terms of feature detection. So we look for necessary and sufficient features that require category membership, right? So if we're looking at all these different types of flowers, from the rose to the lily to the tulip, right, to I don't know what some of these other ones are, we can come up with certain defining features of those things, and then in order to be part of that, it has to a specific individual needs to meet those criteria. So for flower, right, maybe you have petals in a circle, maybe they have a bright color, maybe they grow on trees or stems, and that they smell nice. Problem here is that we can always think of exceptions, right? We can always think of an exception to the rule. So what about something like a water lily? Does a water lily have petals in a circle? Yes. Is it a bright color? Yes. But it doesn't grow on trees or stems. It grows on the water. So therefore, should it be characterized as a flower or not? If we're only going off of common features. So that's kind of a downside here, right? That there could be examples outside the rule that kind of throw these defining common features in disarray. Another way to think of it is that we could think of prototypes, right? So kind of a solution to the issue of bad individuals or tricky, outliers, is that actually we're thinking of a prototype, so that we store these concepts when we're thinking about flowers as an abstract ideal member. So this is the Platonic version, rather than sets of specific features. So this drawing in the middle, while it doesn't really look like any one type of flower in particular, it kind of has a prototype, right, or kind of an ideal version of a flower kind of built in. We can see the kind of floweriness, if you will, of that prototype. And then we can recognize some of the other flower examples that are on the screen as flowers because they are similar in some way to the prototype that we have in our mind. This prototype approach allows us to really kind of differentiate between really good examples of an object or a concept and really bad examples, right? We can think of kind of the ideal version, right? Or what we would call like the prototype or exemplar, instead of more ambiguous ones like that water lily. But it doesn't fully explain what we do with the objects that are difficult to classify. So does the water lily actually fit this prototype? Well, it kind of looks like it, but not really. It is kind of an outlier here. And we don't really know how we synthesize that information. So another way to look at it is that some concepts are very basic, right? Triangles are a polygon with three sides. But others are not, right? So when we're thinking of prototypes, right, we might think more of, if we're thinking of birds now for this example, we might think more of a robin, right, or a blue jay or something as a prototype, or a sparrow as a prototype of a bird. But a penguin, maybe not so much, or an ostrich, maybe not so much. While they are birds, right, they are different in some pretty significant ways that we would say rule out the fact that they can be the best example. Um, Although we do still recognize them as birds because they have other similar features, right? So um, prototypes are useful, especially when we're thinking of things, right? So this is the more, um, well, either Plato or Aristotle would agree with this, that there is this kind of idealized version of things, whether or not we have that born, within us innately, or if that was an example of nurture. That's where Plato or Aristotle would disagree. But in terms of concepts, right, prototypes, best example. Now, going back to our flower analogy, we can think of concepts as theories, right? So this is a little different. So we're not thinking about specific types of, individual characteristics or a specific, kind of model of what we should be looking at. Instead, if we think of concepts as theories, this emphasizes that these concepts are fluid and are changeable, right? So when we have new and ambiguous items, we have to adapt what we've already learned and apply this new information to the theory kind of the case. So does this, I believe that is a bird of paradise flower, does that fit our definition? Well, it certainly doesn't fit the feature detection model, right? The common features. And it definitely doesn't look like a prototypical flower. But if we know about what flowers are, right, in terms of like a definition or a theory, then we can say that yes, this actually is a flower and fits within the theory of a flower pretty easily. This theory, I guess, of concepts or explanation of how concepts work, it's probably a better word to use than theory, really shows us how children learn vocabulary, for instance, that they slowly, what's called accommodate their mental representations of things in slowly over time to accommodate new information. We'll get more into that when we get into human development and cognitive development, but that's for a different unit later in the semester. Related to that, oddly enough, is this idea that concepts are schemas. Okay, if you remember from the very first day of class, I said that schemas are mental representations that include all different aspects of things. So these include relationships with other objects, activities that you might include that are associated with something. So, as well as the individual object by itself. So when we're talking about flowers, right, one of the things that you can think of with schemas and flowers is that some people give flowers to their romantic partner, right? So that is a romantic gesture. Flowers are, that's certainly part of our understanding of flowers, right? It's not just the individual flowers, but also what we do with them. That shows us that we have concepts kind of working as schemas, because it helps us to kind of think about, when we think of flowers, we think about all of the things that flowers, allow. Okay, that was a lot. I actually think I'm going to end this video now, just to kind of have this as a standalone so that you can go back and review it as often as needed, because this is important. There's a lot of nuance here, and please make sure that you reach out with any questions that you have. We'll come back with decision making and how we make decisions both in the brain and the tools that we use for decision making. But in this video, we covered all things related to mental concepts and mental representations, whether that's feature detection theories, prototypical theories, concepts as theories, and concepts as schemas. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next video.